Hello folks, it's week 6 already and it's time to talk about surveys. Like all our research tools that we've got in our toolbox for environmental studies research, surveys have some real strong advantages and some disadvantages compared to other things that we could choose, and we'll compare and contrast them a little bit with interviews since that's what we talked about in class last week. Surveys, a real strength of them is that they're a really powerful tool for doing statistical analysis. So anytime we can do a probabilistic sample and randomize the assignment from the population into our sample, we have an opportunity to test hypotheses using statistical tools of significance and to kind of make explanatory arguments, even make predictions in some cases using the results that we have. It's also really nice tool for using composite measures. This is a thought to hold for a moment because on a slide coming up I'm going to talk in more detail about composite measures like indices and scales that can be really helpful for us in trying to measure complex behaviors through survey questions and answers. Like interviews, surveys are also really flexible. There's a lot of different ways we can administer them: in person, phone, email, on paper, so forth. And they're also really flexible just in terms of the format. There's lots of different ways that we can operationalize our variables through questions and the way we ask them. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And also, like interviews, we just have to be really careful in terms of how we actually do that work, especially how we craft our questions. We really want to make sure we're not just directly asking about our concepts. Our questions have to be accessible, and we have to carefully craft them to avoid lots of different forms of bias that can be introduced. There's some good tips about this in the reading that I assigned from this chapter in Babby's Research Methods textbook. Unlike interviews, you really only have one chance to get a survey right. Once you send it out to your respondents, it has to be correct. Interviews, obviously, you want to have things kind of carefully planned when you do them, but if after the first interview or two you realize that a question isn't working that well, or that you need to maybe kind of rethink things, you can kind of go back to the drawing board a little bit and restart and do some more interviews and kind of mop up for some of those early learning experiences. When you do a survey, you can't really redo it, not without a lot of work, a lot of trouble, a lot of time and effort, maybe even expense in some cases. So you really want to make sure that you get your survey carefully tested and revised so that when it goes out into the wild and you get your responses back, it's exactly what you wanted, and that you're getting the best response for analyzing your research question. Finally, surveys are really useful in community-based research, is that because we can send out a lot of them, we can get a real breadth of responses from our population. It allows us to get a lot of community input and really get a sense of what communities are interested in, what kinds of perspectives or demographics we have within a community. And so surveys are useful in that respect because we can just learn a lot about a community in a broad way through survey tools. We'll talk in more detail in class about some specifics of designing survey questions, and again, we have some nice details in the Babby chapter on how to develop questions and avoid bias, but we have to make sure that our questions are accessible, and that in particular for environmental studies research, we have to be careful about social desirability bias. We talked about this a bit in class last week, but because environmental values are kind of politically correct, we have to make sure that we don't ask questions that are worded in a way such that respondents are going to feel like they kind of have to answer in a certain way to be a good person, and to avoid that kind of judginess that might come from a response. Now, the anonymity in a lot of surveys helps to get around that to some degree, but even when no one's looking over a person's shoulder or sitting face to face with them, that desirability bias may still influence a question, especially if it's worded in such a way as, do you agree that it's important to recycle, or something like that. That really sets up the question in a way such that it's leading and it's about a topic that may have an inherent social desirability bias. So it's kind of a double whammy in that respect. We also have to be really careful that when we craft the responses to our questions, that they're also really developed well so that the choices are exhaustive, in other words, that they include all the possibilities, and that there's no overlap between the different categories. Overall, we want to avoid responses that have a lot of choices. In lot of respects, that's kind of a practical choice that we make. So for example, if you want to learn something about environmental values among Colgate students and you were curious about whether a major that student had made a difference, well, there's like 40 majors at Colgate. So if you just ask people to list their majors and minors, there's a lot of different choices that you can have there. So can you categorize those in such a way that it kind of cuts down on the number of overall choices? It's going to make your life easier when it comes time to doing analysis. So for example, do you really need to know if someone's an econ, a poli-sci, a soc, history, or educational studies or geography major, all the different social science majors, or can you just compress those into the social sciences? That's going to depend on your research question and how important that variation is for you to know. But if you have social science, natural science, university studies, arts and humanities, that compresses the number of choices and makes it a little bit easier for you to do your analysis. Again, there's not really a right or wrong answer there, but it's kind of a balance between how precise your answer is and how much you can kind of compress those results to try to make your analysis easier. In some cases, there's also kind of a trade-off in terms of people's willingness to even answer the question. So for example, if you think of a question like income, really straightforward question, pretty much any kind of survey that you might do might ask about somebody's household income. So it's really common to ask that, but it's also kind of tricky, right? Because income's kind of a personal question. And it may also be complicated just because people might not exactly know what their income is from year to year. They might have a rough idea of it. But if you ask a question like this that says, what is your annual household income? And it's a fill in the blank. How precise of a number can people give? Or are they maybe a little shy about being willing to really kind of just stick a number in that blank? Because they don't want to reveal their income. Especially in the US, people are pretty private about the money that they make and they don't like to share that. So people might skip that question if they don't know the answer or they don't feel like they want to reveal something private like that. So if we can give people a set of choices, and so for example in this construction of the question, we've got 6 different choices they can choose among. Breaking out income into different ranges, they can choose the most appropriate range and they don't have to be quite as precise. They can say, okay, yeah, I think my income is in C. It's somewhere in there. I don't know exactly. It's somewhere around $70,000 a year, depending on the year, depending on their taxes, stuff like that. Maybe they have income that's variable from year to year because they're self-employed or something like that. In any case, it's a little bit easier for people to choose one of those ranges, and they might also feel more comfortable doing it. At the same time, there's a trade-off there, right? We have a less precise answer if it's within that range. We don't know where in that range. So if income was a really important variable in the development of our research question, one of our main things that we think is maybe an independent variable that really drives people's environmental choices, maybe we want the greater precision of that first possibility where you fill in the blank and you get the best possible answer. And we would prefer to use that approach. And maybe in other cases, we just want to get people to respond and we want them to feel comfortable doing so. So we choose the second option. Not a right or wrong answer, but different trade-offs that we choose in terms of doing our research design. We're also going to want to really carefully test our questions, and it's really a good idea to use classmates, use friends, people in the community who could potentially take this test to kind of be your guinea pigs to try out your questions and your responses and have them give you specific comments on your survey instrument before you actually send it out to collect your data. Test, retest. Again, you don't really get a second chance with a survey, so it really pays off to do a lot of work on the front end to carefully craft your questions, revise them before you actually send it out and get that data back. So when I introduced surveys on the first slide, I mentioned that one nice option for doing survey research is to develop an index or a scale. And that's a really useful tool because it allows us to take a complex phenomenon or idea or concept and measure it using multiple survey questions that kind of add up into a composite measure, and take a complex idea like a value that you might have, an opinion you might have, some kind of feeling or attitude, and not having to put it in just one question, but in multiple questions that can kind of add up. And so rather than using that one question, we'll usually have several questions that oftentimes have a spectrum of agreement and disagreement. And you've seen these types of questions many times. They're often kind of incorrectly called Likert scale questions based on this researcher Likert who first developed questions like this. But overall, they kind of say, what do you think about this issue? Recycling is important to me. Do you strongly agree? Do you somewhat agree? Are you neutral? Do you somewhat disagree, or do you strongly disagree? Those are 5 choices that kind of give a spectrum of agreement that we can measure someone's attitudes about something like recycling. If we then assign a number to each of those responses, say 1 to 5, 1 strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree, we can kind of set a number for that response and have a few other questions with similar structures, and then the composite measure is basically a number that we can assign to the value for that overall response or that overall concept. Sounds a little jargony, I know, so let's try to look at an example. One really common way that environmental researchers, especially social science researchers, have tried to do this work is to understand nationally and globally how have values with respect to the environment changed over time. Are we actually becoming more environmentally conscious? Are people have stronger environmental values in the late 20th century into the 21st? One way of describing that is the idea of a post-material kind of set of values. In other words, that people are less materialistic, less focused on economic gains and economic concerns than they were in the past, and those are more strongly balanced with concerns for things like the environment. So researchers have done tons of surveys over the last several decades to kind of track these attitudes and see if they can find trends about them. So here's one example. I know this looks like a lot of text that I just threw on the screen, but this is an example of 9 different questions from an article by some researchers in 2013 where they looked at global indices of environmental concern and these post-material values. So just to take one question, let's take this first one. You can see it says, I do what is right for the environment, even when it costs more money or takes more time. So you can see that the question asks explicitly for people to kind of weigh how much they value the environment versus money in their pocket or time, other resources that they might have. And then in this case, it's not measured on the basis of a spectrum of agreement, but at a spectrum of willingness. So you can imagine that somebody who was not at all willing, we could give them a score of 1 if they answered that. If they were not too willing, we would give them a 2. If they're neutral, a 3. Fairly willing, a 4. Or very willing, a 5. That's that spectrum of not at all willing to willing that we can assign a score to the response for that one question. Then with other questions, we can do the same thing. And so that if everybody on each question gave the most environmentally conscious or aware or supportive answer, they would have a 5 on each one. We'd add them all up. There's 9 questions. They would score 45. That would be the maximum for kind of a supportive environment versus other concerns. On the other hand, if they were scoring on the low end of the spectrum for that support, they would get a 9 as a total because they would score a 1 on every question. Now, one thing to be cautious about and to notice for these questions is that some of them are flipped in terms of the spectrum and whether people support the environment or not. So for example, if you look at question 7 here, it says we worry too much about the future of the environment and not enough about prices and jobs. So this one's flipped. So that if you actually strongly agree with this, you're saying that we worry too much about the environment. So in that case, a score of 5 would actually mean that you were less supportive of the environment. So you might flip the score there so that you actually get a 5 if you answer strongly disagree, and you get a 1 if you strongly agree, so that it stays with that same trend of scoring, and that 45 is the strongest, 9 is the weakest, and so forth. You wouldn't necessarily have to use the numbers in that way, but that gives you hopefully a sense of how you use this method to try to develop a composite score for a set of values about post-material values. So without getting into too much detail, the difference between an index and a scale is that a scale doesn't measure each of the items in a questionnaire the same. It instead puts weights on the different items based on how powerful they are in the overall composite measure. So for example, we talked in class one day about different things that you might do to show your support for the environment. Like if you recycle, that's some effort, but there's a whole infrastructure for recycling that might not necessarily say you're an eco-warrior if you recycle every week. If you participate in an environmental group, and you're a leader for it, that's maybe a stronger commitment. If you donate money, a substantial portion of your money to environmental causes, maybe those are stronger indicators. So if we had a composite measure of environmental activism or environmental behaviors, we might actually weight those differently rather than kind of adding up the score all the same, so that one had a stronger weight overall in the composite measure than the others. Again, we're not going to get into too much detail on that, but that would be one way to develop a measure of environmental behaviors that would help you get at some of those different strengths or weights to those different types of behaviors. Indexes and scales are really powerful tools, but they're kind of complicated to develop. Usually require you to do a lot of testing just on those measures themselves if you want to include them in a survey. So I would recommend that you try to find existing indexes or scales in published research to use for your research rather than developing your own, or to adapt them in some way. There's a lot of them out there that you can find in the literature, so if you find one that looks close to what you're interested in for your own research, you can adapt that, cite where it's coming from, and build on existing research rather than reinventing the wheel for yourself. To conclude, just a little bit about sampling for surveys. Obviously, if we want to do statistical work where we're going to take tests of significance and try to test hypotheses with the data that we have from our survey, we really need to have a probabilistic sampling strategy that we use, something like a simple random sample, a systematic sample, and some of the other ones that we talked about, where there's randomized assignment of the population members into the sample are really critical for us to have appropriate use of those statistical tools. It's also important to have a good response rate, and this can be kind of tricky sometimes, as we discussed in class. It is hard to get a good response rate these days because people are overburdened with requests to do surveys. Ideally, we would get a response rate of 50% or better to have good confidence in the representativeness of our sample and how it relates to the population. Sometimes that's hard to get, and we kind of have to make compromises and do our best to get the best response rate possible. If there's a low response rate, and especially if we kind of really dip much further below that, down to 20% or something like that, really can start to ask questions about, for the people who did participate, are they really truly representative of the population overall? There's some tricks we can do to try to maximize our response rate. One way is that we can set up our survey by letting people know in advance that they have been selected to participate in a sample. In the olden days, we would send a postcard, and so for example, the census, when that comes around every 10 years, there's usually a mailing that goes out to households in advance saying the census is coming, get ready for it, you're going to receive a mailing soon where you'll have to fill that out. Sometimes they might even have multiple mailings, and social media posts and stuff like that that kind of build up the expectation that the census is happening. Obviously, for a smaller scale project like one of your surveys or other folks who don't have those same resources, we can't do it quite to that level, but we might send out a postcard, or we might send a digital equivalent like an email saying, hey, we're doing this research, you've been selected to be in the sample, we really value your participation. Next week you're going to get the actual survey, so please be ready for that. Just so it kind of primes people, prepares them to participate, and that way they're not kind of caught off guard with that. They can maybe think a little bit about whether they want to participate or not, and hopefully that raises your response rate. Also following up, and if you don't get people to respond right away, you check in again after a few days or a week or so, maybe do it 2 times, and then you kind of give up and assume that they're not going to respond after that. But at least 1 or 2 follow-ups are really important to try to maximize response rate. We'll talk in more detail in class about some specific examples of surveys, and we'll talk about the Upstate Institute research project that I asked you to read for class later this week. So all of those will be ways for us to follow up and see some more specific examples and critique some examples too of survey research. So see you soon.